Alright guys, we have made it up to chapter 28 in the rise of progressivism. Now there's going to be two very basic things covered in this PowerPoint. The first is what is progressivism. Secondly, who were some of the main progressive reformers of this time. The first thing we need to look at before we start talking about the reformers is what is progressivism. And basically the definition boils down to it's a belief that an efficient government, and that's the key word there, a government could and should protect the public interest. Now, progressivism came about as a reaction to the perceived injustices that were done during the Gilded Age like industrialism and things like that. And it was a combination of various interests, but it can basically be boiled down into three main groups, which are social, political, and economic. As far as the main issues, I'm not going to run through them all here. You can see it for yourself. But some of the main ones that we're going to hit on in class and go in more in depthly are the dealing with political machines, consumer protection, as well as voting reform. And now the prohibition and the female suffrage and the other ones, though they'll be covered here, some of them may be hit on in later chapters. First group of people we're going to look at here are the early progressive activists, and they're the ones who really get the ball rolling on some of these things and begin to bring to light some of the major issues that were happening. The first one is a guy named Henry DEMAREST Lloyd, and what he did is he came out with a series of articles in a book called Wealth Against Commonwealth in 1899. And he's the first one to really come out and slam Standard Oil on some of their monopolistic and some of their business tactics. The key thing you need to know with regards to him is that he is the beginning, or his work is the first example of what's called investigative journalism. Now, we're going to be talking quite a bit about that as we go throughout the year, particularly to preview a little bit when we get to Watergate and other things, but the roots of it start right here. Another one is THORSTEIN VEBLEN. He comes out with a work called The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, in which he basically blasts the attitudes and habits and things that the nouveau riche did as a part of their life and the ambivalence that they showed towards people below them. If you remember, we talked about the nouveau riche earlier and the fact that it was the top 1% of people, and we talked about some of their leisure stuff and how much property and assets they actually had. The next guy on our list, and probably the first one that you're actually going to be responsible for on the AP test, is a guy named Jacob A. RIIS, who came out with a series of articles and photos called How the Other Half Lives in 1890. A little background on RIIS: he was a police reporter in the city of New York, and because of that he had access to a lot of places that a lot of people in that time period didn't go, particularly the tenement houses in New York. And basically what we're talking about when we say tenement are the slums. This is the lowest of the low. It normally housed recent immigrants, factory workers, the people who are honestly not making a lot of money and not doing very well. What he does is he goes in, and to bring exposure to this issue, he writes these essays in a series of articles to try to bring these things to light to the middle and upper class and give them an idea of things that were going on in New York and other places, because I don't think a lot of these people were aware of this stuff. The next person on our list is a woman named Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote something called Women in Economics in 1898. Basically, the main point of it is it deals with women in the workforce, and what she was saying was that it was time for women to abandon their dependent status and contribute to community through the economy. In other words, by being a part of the workforce, they can translate that to reforms and working in the community. All right, we move from the early progressive activists to a group of people who are known as muckrakers, and you need to be able to categorize these people within this frame. Muckraking itself was a term that was coined by Teddy Roosevelt while he was president. And basically what these guys are journalists who try to expose the evils of society. Now, the key part that you need to pay attention to is that they did not offer solutions to the problems in most cases, and they themselves didn't solve the problems. They just brought the issues to light so people could come in after it, be aware of it, and attempt to solve it. When Roosevelt comes up with this phrase, he's using the term negatively because muckrakers, as you will see, only focused on the negatives of society. And Roosevelt felt that it wasn't fair that they did that without balancing it with a little positivity as well with some of the good things that were going on. The first person we're going to talk about is Lincoln Steffens, and he wrote something called The Shame of the Cities in 1902, which was a series of articles compiled, a series of magazine articles compiled into a book later on. In this work, he's talking mainly about the corruption that had come about between business and government. And in particular, what he found when he went in and started investigating this was that there was a whole lot of what's called graft going on. Now, graft is nothing more than giving gifts in return for political favors, or as we've called it before, bribery. The big thing that he was trying to do was he was aiming to raise awareness so people would come out and call for change. And you'll see that with a lot of these muckrakers. They bring the issue to light, and then they do it to raise awareness where other people can come out and call for the changes that need to occur because of the issue. Next, we have Ida M. Tarbell, someone else who comes out and starts exposing the ruthless, monopolistic business practices and treatment of other business by Rockefeller and Standard Oil. What it ends up at the end of the day leading to is support for antitrust legislation, which we'll talk about when we get to Roosevelt later on in the chapter. Next on the list is Upton Sinclair, and this is probably the one that you're going to remember the most out of this chapter because it's the most vivid descriptions of the problems that we're looking at. Upton Sinclair writes a book, a novel called The Jungle in 1906, in which his original intention was to focus on how bad factory workers, in particular meat packers, how bad their lives were and the conditions that they had to go to. The thing that comes about with it, though, is that his descriptions of what went on in the meatpacking industry were so vivid and so illustrative and so, to be quite honest with you, disgusting, as you'll find out, that becomes the focus of the book. And like I said, we're going to talk about this stuff a lot more in-depthly as we go. But for our purposes, you need to know him, the book that he wrote, what it was about, and the fact that the end result leads to a lot of reforms in meat inspection and food safety, partly because of what people were outcrying about and partly because foreign sales of meat after this came out, particularly in Europe, dropped by half. Moving on to our next guy was Frederick W. Taylor and a concept called scientific management. The main things you need to know about this. Number one, it deals with factors of production. In other words, how can you make more product more efficiently and cheaper? And that's what scientific management does. It's trying to maximize worker efficiency, as well as reduce cost and increase profits. Now, when Taylor comes out with this, it brings immediate dividends to factory owners in the fact that they can now produce more of their product and do it more cheaply. From a worker's standpoint, though, there were several reactions to this. And the first one was they felt they had a loss of power because there's more machine work coming in. They're being isolated to one very specific job. And to be quite honest with you, they're bored. All right? They feel like they're losing power and their jobs are very monotonous. So that's, from a worker standpoint, is their reaction. From a management perspective, when they institute these things that go in, these very specific jobs that people do in an attempt to make the process more efficient, managers feel like their powers are being taken out of their hands. So from a worker and management and worker standpoint, they don't really go for this. But from an owner standpoint, they really enjoyed it because they made more money and they didn't have to put as much money in. Speaking of factories, let's move on to the factory conditions for workers and in particular child workers as well. There were a lot of problems going on in factories. We've hit on them before, but this is just kind of a review. The first problem is insecurity. As we've talked about, when you're doing a very low-skilled job, in other words, if you're running a punch press or running a machine, it's not very difficult. And these workers were worried that they could be fired for any reason and replaced very easily. Also, as we've talked about, the fear of injury or death. The more machines you put in, the more specific things become. And more moving parts, there's more of a chance for injury of death because, as I brought up before, there's no OSHA, there's no safety standards, and the ones that they do have are very low. Also, another problem or another hardship that workers have to deal with is that women and children were paid a lot less for the jobs that they did. We've talked about that before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Also, there are very few African Americans in factories because at this time, African Americans, for the most part, were considered too low in society and too unskilled to work in these factories. So they were discriminated against on a regular basis when applying for these jobs. And for that reason, they were forced into even lower paying jobs. Next on our list are sweatshops. These were illegal factories that were normally located in the back of buildings or on the top floor, so they were very much hidden out of sight and even less regulated than factories were at this time. Because of this, look, we're talking about the major problems we've dealt with everywhere. Terrible working conditions, low wages, long hours, and all that kind of stuff. It was basically considered something called home-based piecework. Now, piecework is a pretty important vocab term, and what it means is that you get paid not by the hour, you don't get paid on salary, you get paid by how much you produce. The two major industries that were normally in this sweatshop category were garment industries, such as making clothes and things like that, and also cigar rolling. Most of the employees in these places were recent immigrants who had not been in the country very long because they were looking for any job they could possibly get and were very vulnerable during this transition period from immigration to becoming citizens. And a lot of the employees were mostly women and some children, but not as much as the factory system. Speaking of child labor, we're going to move on to that for a second. In 1900, 1.75 million kids under the age of 16 had jobs, not including farm labor, because that's a completely different set of statistics and a different kind of labor. The reason for this is a lot of these families who lived in cities, particularly recent immigrants, could not survive without as much income as possible coming in from everyone in the family. Some of the problems that came around with this is obviously if you're working in a factory, you cannot go to school. So it's leading to low education. It's leading to a cycle of unskilled, low-paying labor and stuff like that. Progressives come out against this, and they're campaigning against a lot of things, particularly child labor, and also for higher adult wages. All right, so they're trying to kind of level things up. The last thing on the slide refers to Mother Jones and the Children's Crusade. Just a little background on that. Basically, Mother Jones, who was the person who was in charge of this, basically got up a group of children and they marched. They performed a march towards Theodore Roosevelt's summer home. And what they were doing was trying to bring attention to the fact that all of these children were having to work rather than go to school, and they were trying to persuade him to end child labor and get these kids an education where they could succeed as they grew older. A little bit more with child labor, moving on to the next slide. As far as these bullets on here, the National Child Labor Committee in 1904, working towards child welfare and child labor regulations, as a lot of these are, they hired a guy named Lewis Hines to go out and document some of the abuses and some of the problems with child labor, and he came out with a series of photographs depicting some of the hardships and what it looked like with children working in these factories. The U.S. Children's Bureau basically does the same thing, child labor laws, and they see a lot of success with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which we'll deal with when we get up to the 30s. Another guy who comes into play that brought recognition to the abuses that were going on with child labor was a guy named John SPARGO, who came out with something called the Bitter Cry of the Children. To wrap this up, we're going to move along to political reforms, and like I said earlier, we'll handle this a little bit more in-depthly in class when we talk about political machines, but there are some concepts that you need to know that are being very important moving towards your test. The first person, and really the only one for the purposes of this PowerPoint, is Robert LaFollette, who was from Wisconsin and ran something called the Wisconsin Experiment, which was basically trying to take power away from political machines and business trust and give it back to the people. That is the whole point of what he's trying to do. Some terms that came out of this that you need to be aware of. One is the direct primary, in which voting is open to all voters in a political party. Initiative, which is a citizen-introduced bill. In other words, anybody can try to get a law passed at any time by introducing it. You may have to get a certain number of signatures to get it on the ballot, but there are ways, depending on where you're located, to get this stuff happened. Another one is referendum, a public vote by yes or no on proposed laws. This normally deals with social issues in a lot of cases. The best example in Obion County in the last several years is liquor by the drink. I mean, they put it on the ballot for a few years and it got voted down. But once it got through, that's the reason we have Applebee's and Buckets and places like that. Basically, it's giving people a voice to it, and that's what all of these do. And last but not least is recall, in which citizens can remove elected officials from office. You can, at any point in time, try to get a governor, senator, mayor, it doesn't matter who it is, kicked out of office, but you have to get a certain number of signatures, and there's a certain process you have to go through to do this. Alright guys, that wraps up the first one of these that we've tried. Like I said, this is the bare basics for Chapter 28, but it's things that we may not be able to focus on or have time to look at in class. So you need to use this as a study guide. Use it for whatever you need to be successful on the test. I hope it wasn't too hard to listen to. I promise you they will get better as we go for the rest of the year. Just to be on the safe side and make sure that anybody's listening to this, Burden, you need to turn in your Chapter 15 reading questions on Thursday. So let's see if he paid attention to it and if he made it all the way to the end. We'll cover this in class, and the next one will deal with Chapter 29, and we'll start getting into World War I.